I'm going to give folks just a minute to join and then we'll start. All right, we can go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to this week's session of ELI Summer School, Hazardous Waste Insights. My name is Chandler Randall and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. Please join us each Thursday this summer for summer school sessions, such as this one covering key topics in environmental law. Our next and final session is next Thursday on environmental justice. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through Zoom's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send us your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our amazing panelists for joining us today to lend her expertise to this webinar. While I will briefly introduce her, her full speaker bio is posted on our website, eli.org, and I encourage you to check out her experience and expertise in more detail there. I would also like to quickly note that our second panelist was unable to join us today due to personal reasons. She had planned to cover issues pertaining to CERCLA, and therefore we will not be able to cover this topic today. But if you would like to learn more about CERCLA, I highly recommend visiting the ELI website to watch past programming and also find valuable materials there. Now, as we begin, I would like to briefly introduce Charlotte Mooney. Charlotte is the Chief of the Cleanup Programs Branch at the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She has over 30 years of experience at the agency, and Charlotte, we are so thrilled to have you here with us. With that, I will turn things over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chandler. So Chandler threw me a curveball calling me this morning and telling me that it was just me you guys are going to have to listen to. So I'm going to do the best I can. And I wish I could teach you more about CERCLA, but you wouldn't appreciate it if I tried. So I thought, since I'll have a little bit, we have a little bit of flexibility with time today because of that, I thought I'd start off with something of just a little bit of a history. I have been in the environmental field for, Chandler said 30 years. I think it's kind of a lot more than that at this point. Oh yeah, it's 30 some years at EPA and some years before that doing environmental work commercially. And so I kind of feel like you guys are stuck with me giving a little bit of history of sort of my perception of the world of hazardous waste sites, cleanups, because I was lucky enough I graduated from school in 1984 and had studied geology and was sort of noticing that most of the jobs out there were in petroleum engineering and petroleum geology, which wasn't something I was particularly interested in. And they had just started, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, they had just started an environmental sciences program. And so my last couple of years, I had taken some environmental science courses and was really, really interested. And coming out of school at that point in time, it really was sort of the beginning of our awareness as a society that the way we were managing waste wasn't doing so well. Things were not going well. And so I feel lucky in that I've kind of been here through the evolution of the field. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about it. So as I was coming out of school, we were finding out about things like and you probably know these names, I hope so anyway, Love Canal, which was that lovely pit of hazardous waste that ended up underneath a school in a neighborhood. Times Beach, which was a town, or more than a town, more rural area, I think I'm not sure which state exactly, where some guy had decided that it was a really great idea to charge people to take away their used oil or sort of used oils, and then also charge other people to spray it on dirt roads to keep the dust down, which was a great business proposition. It's good if you can make money on both sides, but really a disaster. And the used oils had all kinds of contaminants in it and were really very toxic and caused a lot of health problems, and was sort of a classic example of something I'll talk a little bit later about, how recycling is a difficult issue for waste management, very difficult, because that sounded great, right? Used oil, keep the dust down, but not a good result. The other one you probably heard about, Valley of the Drums, was literally that, a valley of drums of hazardous waste. So all of these, sort of high profile sites were being identified. But there was just tons and tons more across the country, because people just weren't really aware that putting stuff out in the back 40 wasn't okay. And that was sort of the normal waste management practices, and paying money to get stuff managed differently was expensive, and why do it? So we sort of created ourselves a problem. So as that became much more obvious, things at the federal level, RCRA and CERCLA were passed. The Resource Conservation Recovery Act is my baby, which you're going to have to learn something about today, which I'm actually thrilled, because it's one that I think is really important for anyone practicing, not only just in the environmental field, but in business in general, because any business, any operation, any kind of commercial activity generates waste. And so making sure that you are at least aware of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act program, and how it ensures that waste is managed properly so that we don't end up with more love canals, is really an important thing for you to be aware of, regardless as to where you end up practicing or what you end up doing in your career. So I was thinking about it, and sort of at the federal level, RCRA came along to make sure that we don't have that kind of activity continuing. Superfund, or CERCLA, was passed in order to set up a program to clean up those past problems. And then as the field developed, CERCLA, specifically the Superfund program, is really aimed at sort of the worst of the worst kinds of cleanups. And there's a whole system for identifying which are the worst of the worst cleanups, called the hazard ranking system, that sort of ranks looking at what the contaminants are and what the potential exposures are. And the Superfund program then focuses on the worst. There are, however, many, many, many other contaminated sites, places, businesses, properties, residential areas that aren't really sort of at that Superfund level. And so over time, a whole range of cleanup programs have developed that address all different kinds of cleanup issues. For example, in my office, the Office of Land and Emergency Management here in EPA, we manage the Superfund, or CERCLA program. We manage the Resource Conservation Recovery Act program, which you're going to learn something about. We manage the underground storage tanks program, which was a whole program designed. It's actually part of the RCRA statute, but it was a whole program designed to deal with the fact that gas stations, underground storage tanks filled with gas, guess what? They leak. And the way that they were initially designed and installed really didn't sort of recognize that fact. There's some chemistry reasons with, if you have a steel tank in soil with gasoline in it, the steel is likely to start to deteriorate over time. And so that really wasn't taken into account initially. So the whole underground storage tanks program was designed to pretty much try across the country to deal with that by dealing with all the existing leaking underground storage tanks, and also building in leak detection and leak prevention engineering mechanisms to deal with that problem. Other kinds of cleanup programs have popped up. The Brownfields program is also managed out of my office, which is more of a community-based grant program for communities that would like to work on cleaning up potentially brownfields i.e. Places where there has been industrial activity, and cleaning them up for redevelopment and reuse. So the Brownfields program, each program kind of has its own scope, its own target problem, and its own funding mechanisms and legal background around who's responsible for doing the cleanup and how's that going to happen. So those are sort of the big federal programs that have developed over time. But there's lots of other programs as well. Most states have their own, what they usually call their state Superfund program, which is generally aligned something along the lines of our Superfund program, but generally is dealing with problem sites that are a problem in that state, priority problems in that state, but not rising to the level of a federal Superfund cleanup. So most states do have state Superfund programs. Many states have also voluntary cleanup programs where they have sort of systems designed to engage with the responsible party, whomever it may be, and work through a voluntary process to get that cleanup done and give the company or whoever's doing the cleanup credit for getting it done and getting it done properly. Some states have programs aimed specifically at dry cleaners, which is an issue, another sort of problem in the way we have designed our processes over time. Dry cleaners tend to have issues with leaking solvents, and so that some states have dry cleaner programs. There's just sort of wherever different problems have been identified, different programs have popped up to try to figure out how to deal with them. So with that background, recognizing that the world has evolved and there are sort of lots of different cleanup programs, lots of different ways to work through. If you're working for a company that has cleanup issues that need to be dealt with, lots of different mechanisms. Oh, another one I wanted to mention also was real estate transfer laws that have popped up in states that are, again, designed to try to catch what contamination may have happened in the past and make sure that there's a mechanism in place to get that contamination dealt with through the time when a piece of real estate passes from one hand to another. So there's just lots of different ways that have evolved to deal with contamination. But in my personal opinion, the most important one is RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which actually, the piece of RCRA that I work in now is a cleanup program, and I'll go through that a little bit at the end. But the real purpose of RCRA is to make sure that we don't have this continue into the future. So the RCRA program is a prevention program. As I think the slide says, it's all about prevention. The whole idea is to try to make sure that we don't have these kinds of problems happening again. And I think it works really well in general. There are certainly some areas for improvement, but I think it works really, really well. And I think it was designed by Congress to work really well and makes a lot of sense. So why don't we go through it? I'm going to sort of run through the basics of the RCRA program, just not expecting that you would memorize any details or anything like that, but just so that you're aware of it, because I do think it's something worth being aware of. Like I said, no matter where you end up or what kind of work you end up doing. So Chandler, why don't you, or whoever's rolling the slides. So we're going to go through a quick overview. What's hazardous waste, who's regulated, the definition of solid waste and recycling, which is one of the most sticky wicket parts of the RCRA program. And then subtitle C, corrective action, which is the part of the program that I'm currently managing that is actually a cleanup program. But first, we'll talk about the whole prevention system. And next slide, please. Next slide. So basically, it's really a logical program. It's basically a cradle to grave tracking system and management system to require best practices for managing waste. And the subtitle C portion of the statute addresses specifically hazardous waste. So the statute required EPA to identify specifically what are hazardous wastes and hence subject to these requirements. There's a system for tracking waste from cradle to grave. There's requirements for proper treatment, storage, and disposal. And then there's corrective action for past and present releases at treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, which is my baby at the moment. Next slide. So the way the program is set up, and I put those two bullets there in red because I think this is one thing that, if you remember anything about how the RCRA program works, this is probably the one to remember. EPA in the statute was required to set national minimum standards for the whole system, but it's also a state delegated program, which is very different. Superfund, for example, handles state involvement quite differently. It's more of a federally run program. So it makes a big difference that RCRA is a state authorized program. So most of the states are authorized. We go through a process of the state, when they get their regulations in place, there's a process by which EPA reviews them and reviews the state's authorities and their enforcement programs to make sure that the program will be adequate. And then the state is actually authorized to run the program in lieu of EPA, and that in lieu of is really important. So if you're working for a company in a state, the RCRA regulations of that state are actually the official requirements that you would have to comply with, not the federal regs, although the state regs, as you can see there, although they can be more stringent, they have to be equivalent, at least as stringent as the federal regs. So the federal regs are a base. Many states regulations are basically the same as the federal program. Some states even just reference the federal regulations directly. But it's really important to recognize that the official authorized implementing agency is the state. Now, the state gets a lot of backup from EPA. We have our regional offices work very closely with the states, and there's sort of a work sharing arrangement whereby EPA does, for example, inspections. The EPA will do some inspections in authorized states, but it's all coordinated and work together with the state. One thing you might hear about RCRA is it's really complicated. And it's true, it is. It's really complicated, which is partly, well, you'll see why, I think, when we go through this. It's difficult to write a program that's specific enough to make sure that the right things are happening, but without getting into some complexity. And you'll see this, probably the most famous area of complexity is the recycling regulations, and you'll see why. But just to note, there are some other chemicals that are managed or regulated by other programs. For example, PCBs are regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act, asbestos as well. So there are some specific other toxic materials that you probably should be aware of. So next slide. So just so you know, we're going to go through RCRA here, and I hope you get a kick out of it. I find it to be a really well designed program. So first of all, as I mentioned, so the statute required EPA to define what is hazardous waste, and you have to do that in order for people to know whether they are managing something that is subject to the program or not. Next slide. So the way that Congress set up the program is, at first seems kind of normal. Like, let's think about this. Okay, in order for it to be a hazardous waste, it has to be a waste. And the term, the sort of term for generic waste in RCRA is the term solid waste. And this is where people always make fun of RCRA. Because the definition of solid waste includes things like solid, liquid, or contained gaseous material. So right off the bat, it does seem a little difficult to follow. But in fact, the whole concept of solid waste is really based around that word discarded. If something's a waste, how do you know if it's a waste? Well, if it's being discarded, it's a waste. Okay, that seems reasonable. So The discard concept is pretty much how we determine whether something is a waste under RCRA, is a solid waste under RCRA. And if it's a solid waste, it might be a hazardous waste. If it's not a solid waste, it cannot be a hazardous waste, which you'll see in a little bit. But basically, a hazardous waste is something that can cause or significantly contribute to an increase in mortality or incapacitating reversible illness. That sounds bad, right? That's right out of the statute. And it's something that poses a substantial present or potential hazard to human health and the environment when improperly treated, stored, transported, or disposed of. So that's kind of the statutory generic standard. Next slide, which was codified in regulations in two chunks of wastes. There are listed hazardous wastes and there are characteristic hazardous wastes. Next slide. And they are, so listed hazardous waste is basically what it sounds like. There's a list in the regs. So you can go look it up. 40 CFR, part 261, subpart, well, it's really C and D. Lots of lists. There are, I think, 4 different lists that have different types of wastes. And they are all on the list because they have been determined to be toxic, acutely toxic, or there are a few on there that actually are on there because they consistently exhibit one of the 4 characteristics. So the idea is that EPA goes through and figures out what wastes, for example, generated by an industry generally, and whether that waste is toxic, using the standard set out by Congress. Next slide. Characteristics, there are 4, and characteristics is a little different. You can't go look it up whether the waste you have in front of you is hazardous. It's basically based on the characteristics of that waste and whether it poses a threat if mismanaged. So there's ignitable wastes, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. Next slide. So ignitability sounds, it's probably somewhat intuitive. There are specific test methods that help you determine this, but it's something that basically can catch fire and burn. It's pretty intuitive. Corrosivity similarly is basically something that's really corrosive and that could really cause damage either to people or, say, for example, to an underground storage tank. Corroding an underground storage tank is not a good idea. Reactivity are things that literally are explosive, and that includes things like munitions, fireworks, all kinds of things that go boom, I guess, basically. And then toxicity is a little more complicated. There's a test method specified that is designed to model what would happen in a landfill, basically. And so it's sort of a test method that it's pretty simplistic, really, when you think about it. You take the waste, you put it, I'm going to be very general here, you put it in a jar with the right liquid, and then you shake it for a long time. That's pretty much what the machinery does. And then you measure what leaches out of that waste and what levels you might find any hazardous constituents in that leach material that leaches out of the waste. So it's a pretty simple test, but it catches a lot of materials that do have toxic constituents in them. Next slide. So that's basically what's a hazardous waste. And that's key to know, because if you're not managing a hazardous waste, you're really not subject to the RCRA program. Things that are not hazardous, wastes that are not hazardous, are generally regulated as sort of non-hazardous wastes, and largely at the state level. Subtitle D of RCRA does require EPA to set out some general standards for the states, but state regulations is where you'll find anything having to do with non-hazardous waste. So that would be both, for example, municipal waste, construction and demolition, debris waste, industrial, non-hazardous industrial wastes. So that's all handled at the state level. and does vary somewhat from state to state. So it's important to be aware of how the state has handled their solid waste regulatory issues. So who's regulated and how? Next slide. So basically the whole idea, as I mentioned, is a cradle to grave tracking and best practices management program. And so the path that hazardous waste would take from the first time it arrives or is created to the end of its life is subject to RCRA. And so it basically starts with the generator, who is the person who creates that waste, sort of, a factory, any kind of industrial operation, anything that generates waste. And lots of things that you wouldn't think of as sort of industrial operations generate hazardous waste. I think we'll mention a couple of them, but things that commonly folks wouldn't think of, maybe batteries is a really good example, fluorescent lamps, all kinds of sort of standard things that you might use yourself, actually. It turns out if it's generated by a commercial entity, could be a hazardous waste. So that waste is to be managed by a transporter. Generally, trucking is the most common. Also, rail. Not a lot of water shipping, but that does happen too. And then the facility that treats, store, or disposes of that hazardous waste, so either a landfill, an incinerator, some kind of treatment, storage, or disposal facility, which we call Tsdfs, treatment, storage, disposal facility. So that's basically who's managed, everybody who's regulated, everybody in the system. And then basically across that system, there's sort of a basic bottom line set of requirements. Everybody in that system has to notify, and there's a form that you notify to EPA, and EPA issues an identification number to each person who notifies. You have to use the hazardous waste manifest, which is a tracking document, and you have to comply with whatever the appropriate requirements are for your role in this system. Next slide. So the tracking system is sort of the key to the whole thing. And basically, it started out as what was known as the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest, which back in the day was I can't remember how many carbon copies there were on the back of it. I think maybe 8. Anyway, a lot, which made it really hard for people trying to write really hard. But it literally was a multi-part, multi-copy form that's jointly required by DOT and EPA, which has all kinds of information on it. I think the next slide has a picture of it. Next slide. Yeah, you can't see that, but that's sort of what it looks like roughly. And so basically you have to fill out what wastes you're shipping, what they're described as, quantities, all kinds of information about the shipment itself. And then the key thing is where it's going. And I think, can you go back one slide? I think that would help me. Yeah, I think the key thing is that once the waste reaches its destination, which would generally be a treatment, storage, or disposal facility, that receiving facility is required to sign off on the manifest documenting that they received the waste. And then what happens is they're required to send a copy of that signed shipping paper back to the original generator. So the original generator, who really is the responsible person who generated this waste in the first place, is to get a copy documenting that that waste got to the place they sent it to, where it was supposed to go, and that they know that, and that they can document that, and they don't have to worry about that waste anymore once it got to its proper location. The trick is, if they don't get that copy back within a certain period of time, they are required to initiate looking into what happened. So they have to call up the receiving facility. Did you get it? Did you not? Document what the results are. And if the material has not arrived, really start an investigation to figure out what happened and locate the waste and make sure that it's managed properly. That is not a good thing. You don't want to have that happen. It's much better if it gets there on time. So next slide, and then the one after that, actually. So there you go. In 2018, we launched a electronic tracking system to replace the multi-copy hard copy manifest system, which is great. It's actually been really exciting and fun to watch. It was really difficult we had to get legislative authority to build it as a user fee based system so that everybody who uses the system is actually paying for the development and the management of that system. So there is a fee for each shipment that you ship with a manifest. But now you don't have to do that whole carbons and copies and no, you can't read what's there because there's too many copies. So it is now an electronic system. And that was tricky to design, sort of a chain of custody system where each person signs off that also has the flexibility to change if something changes in the shipping path during shipment. It sort of had to be flexible enough to handle all kinds of contingencies, but yet certain enough that you can demonstrate that the waste got to where it was supposed to be. So that it's actually a good cost savings for people. That whole paper process was very expensive. Much better accuracy and timeliness, and much better awareness of problems quicker so that they can get resolved. Next slide. So the generator is the person who creates that waste and initiates the manifest tracking process. And they are regulated in 3 levels based on the amount of waste that they generate. And they are called, very adorably, I think, very small quantity generators, small quantity generators, and large quantity generators. So basically you have to figure out how much waste you generate, how much hazardous waste you generate per month. And then that slots you into one of those categories. And then you are pretty much slotted into what your regulatory requirements are. Each of those categories has time limits for how much time they can store waste on site. Large quantity generators, for example, can store their waste for 90 days, but they have to ship it off by day 89 or 90, I guess, technically. Small quantity generators have 180 days. So the time factor is, again, built in just to make sure that things keep moving. Let's not have waste sitting around where people can forget it or bad things happen. So it enforces that let's get waste handled properly. Next slide. Generators also have other requirements that are, again, tiered based on their size category. ID numbers, waste accumulation times, and quantity limits. I just mentioned those. Requirements for contingency planning and emergency planning, inspections, employee training. There are technical requirements. Generators are allowed to store waste on site in tanks or containers. And so there are specific requirements for that. Things like, you have to separate your container of ignitable waste from things a certain distance. You have to have leak detection on your tank systems, things like that. Compliance with land disposal standards, which are some requirements that were added in 1984 amendments to the statute that are very specific about what kind of treatment is required before a waste is land disposed, i.e. put in a landfill. And then tracking requirements, meaning the manifest. Next slide. So transporters, pretty basic. They still, again, have to notify and get an ID number. They have to play their part in the manifest tracking system and then comply with DOT regulations. That DOT covers all the sort of safety requirements for shipping. Next slide. And then the Tsdfs, treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So this is the facility that actually receives and manages the waste. Sometimes into perpetuity, you'll see what I mean by that. But regulation of Tsdfs is implemented through RCRA permits, and a RCRA permit is not a thing to get involved with if you can avoid it, I guess I would say. If you're a generator of hazardous waste, most generators choose to ship their waste off within the 90-day time frame and avoid becoming a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, because it's not a easy project, and it's something that folks who do our treatment, storage, and disposal facilities and get permits, that's really what they do. That's really the sort of the main purpose of their company, usually because it's a big heavy lift to get permits. It's a heavy lift to manage these wastes safely. And so generally the system has played out that historically lots of folks were managing their waste, but most folks who generate waste have chosen to be just a generator and to let the Tsdfs do the actual managing of wastes through these permits, which are in an authorized state, are actually implemented by the state with some EPA involvement. But the permits are really pretty elaborate. They cover all kinds of record keeping, contingency planning, the manifest system, training for employees, what kind of reports have to go into EPA. Say, for example, if there's an incident of some sort, a spill or a fire, reporting is required, or to the state, actually. EPA ID numbers, there are security requirements, making sure that you don't have trespassers jumping into roll-off boxes and bad things happening, that kind of thing. Financial assurance is required for certain types of facilities to make sure that there is money available to deal with any issues that might arise. Closure plans, which sort of lay out how the facility will be closed at the end of its operating life. Inspections, operating criteria, design criteria, engineering certifications, all very detailed technical requirements for each type of waste management unit. Next slide. So like I said, it's all about prevention, and closure is kind of a tricky issue for RCRA, for the whole waste management system. And basically there are two types of treatment, storage, disposal facilities. Those that are going to clean close. So that would be, a facility that has tanks, containers, treatment operations, incinerators, anything that's not a land-based disposal unit, where the goal is to continue operations, do all the right things, and when you're done, the waste has either been rendered non-hazardous and disposed of elsewhere as a non-hazardous waste, or removed. But those facilities, the whole idea is that they will completely clean, close, and decontaminate the site. So they will basically be as if the facility was never there. So that's clean closure. So there's lots of requirements around how you go about doing that. And then there's the facilities that are waste in place, where treated waste is going to remain in place, which is basically landfills. And so there are all kinds of engineered systems required to close a landfill and for post-closure management, which means maintaining that, say, for example, the cap on a landfill, maintaining groundwater monitoring to ensure that there are no releases, and then responding to releases if anything were to happen and be detected in that groundwater monitoring. So those are sort of the two types of closure facilities that happen in the system. Next slide. So financial assurance is required in the permit to make sure that there is money available to do both of those things, clean closure or post-closure, and also to cover things like accidents. The financial instruments are sort of traditional financial instruments: trust funds, surety bonds, letters of credit, insurance. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I think that the definition of solid waste and recycling is one of the more curious parts of the RCRA statute, and I think it's probably one of the most curious parts of the environmental field overall, and I'll show you why. Next slide. Basically, how do you know if something's really being recycled? And this has been a question that has come up, has been litigated a lot. There was the initial regulations were litigated. We revised them, more litigation. It's been sort of a string of revising the regulations to try to get it very specific and clear, and then litigation that required us to get it even more clear. So I think it's pretty settled now. The regulations are, I hope, helpful, although they're somewhat confusing. In order to figure out whether something is really being recycled, and just for general purposes, the idea is if it's really being recycled, it's not a waste because it's being continued to be used in commerce. But if it's only being recycled, like spraying it on the ground for dust suppression, that's probably a waste. And so the regulations are really designed to try to draw that line, which is very, very tricky. Next slide. So in order to figure out through the regulations whether something is a solid waste or not, if it's recycled, you will run into this table in 40 CFR 261.2 C3. And as you can see, it's kind of complex. Basically, there are 4 types of recycling: use constituting disposal, energy recovery, reclamation, and speculative accumulation. Reclamation is sort of the most common one. And as you can see there, different types of materials are considered to be or not be solid wastes based on the way that table is laid out. And it's a wild ride trying to figure out how we got to that, but it actually kind of works out in the long run. The speculative, but I'm not going to go through the details of it. The speculative accumulation column is there to catch the fact that people often think they're going to recycle something, and then they can't quite figure out how to do it. And so they don't. And so after some period of time, we call it speculative accumulation. And after some period of time, the regulation says, sorry, you're not recycling it, you're speculatively accumulating it. And unless it's this one exception, commercial chemical products, it's a solid waste, and you need to start managing it as a hazardous waste through the hazardous waste management system. Next slide. I think the key thing to remember about recycling, and I hope this helps explain why it's so complicated, why the regulations are so complicated, it's trying to get at this concept of legitimate recycling. For example, when you put something in the recycling bin at your house, let's say something plastic, you think it's being recycled, you believe it's being recycled, but is it going to get recycled or not? We don't really know. So figuring that out matters a lot. And if you're managing hazardous waste, it really, really matters. So this is an example, a real example of why it's really challenging to figure out whether something is legitimately recycled or not. So this is an example. In a metal casting foundry, you use lead. It's not really lead contaminated, it's intentionally leaded sand because the lead gives the sand a property that is needed for the casting. So that sand can be reused a certain number of times in the metal casting process, but after a while it no longer works well and has to be discarded. And so the idea of reusing that sand in a metal casting process sounds like a really good recycling project, a legitimate recycling process. And that would be considered not a solid waste under our regulations because you're continuing to use it as a beneficial product. And that's not the realm of RCRA. However, were you to, for example, yes, this really happened, sell lead contaminated foundry sand at a store that packages it and calls it playground sand, this is not a legitimate recycling activity. And hence that material at that point would be a solid waste. So I hope that helps. Next slide. This is just the way the regulation lays out the factors for determining whether recycling is legitimate. The material has to provide a useful contribution. It has to actually produce a valuable product. It has to be managed as if it really is a valuable commodity. And then it has to not contain significant concentrations of hazardous constituents that are not appropriate for that recycling activity. And those are straight out of the regs. So next slide. Okay, my favorite part. So when I've worked, how long did you say, Chandler? Okay, it's true. Over 30 years at RCRA, at EPA, most of it in RCRA. And I worked many years in the regulatory development office side of our office. Worked for many years on the definition of solid waste regulations. I've worked in the on the more solid waste recycling side, and I currently manage the corrective action program for RCRA. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Next slide. It's again aimed at that prevention idea, but it's a little different in that Congress recognized that a lot of facilities that were managing hazardous waste had actually had problems in the past and therefore were contaminated. And problems can happen if those facilities go out of business. They can become sort of abandoned sites and end up in the Superfund program or causing problems for folks. So Congress actually wrote in 1984, sort of added a little bit, next slide, provision into the statute that required treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, either historically, like facilities that had managed hazardous waste in the past or currently managing hazardous waste, to clean up contamination from releases of hazardous waste from fence line to fence line and even off-site if it has perhaps wandered off-site in the groundwater, for example. So this provision was added, and that right there is a map of the roughly 4,000 treatment, storage, disposal facilities that are currently in our corrective action program cleaning up contamination. Next slide. And these provisions were added in the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments of 1984, basically requiring corrective action. And it's built, the requirement is actually built into the permit. So part of that RCRA permit will include corrective action provisions. There are regulations there. You can see 264.101. However, the corrective action program is very light on regulatory requirements and heavy on being driven by guidance. Next slide. And the guidance lays out a process. That's weird. Next slide. Ooh, fancy. I didn't remember that it did this. Next slide. Let's just go through. Can you get all those bullets on there? Yeah. Basically, this is the process that, that a cleanup goes through. First, you identify where you have had releases, then you characterize the contamination, you identify possible remedies, and then you select and perform a remedy. Next slide. So corrective action measures, and by that I mean, how do we measure whether cleanup is happening? And these are the measures that we use. There are 2 environmental indicators, which is at a particular cleanup, have human exposures been gotten under control? And then has migration of contaminated groundwater been got? I don't like the structure of my sentences here, but anyway, is it under control? So human exposures and migration of contaminated groundwater, those are sort of the initial environmental, let's make sure these things are done so that communities are protected. Then remedy construction is when the actual remedy has been designed, selected, designed, and constructed. And then the final measure is performance standards attained, which means that whatever the cleanup standards that were identified in the design of the cleanup have actually been met. Next slide. There's one more called Ready for Anticipated Use, which is pulls together a couple of different things that's trying to allow for use of a piece of property that has been cleaned up to the point that it's safe for that use, but the cleanup isn't finished. And I'll give you an example. Say at a facility you have both contaminated soil and groundwater, but the groundwater is going to take some years to clean up with, say, a pump and treat system. But you're going to remove the contaminated soil, say down to 2 feet, and then build a parking lot. So you're going to pave the whole area. So that site, although the cleanup is not complete because the groundwater cleanup is not going to be complete for some period of time, the action, the cleanup actions that have been taken make it safe for uses such as a parking lot. That would not be safe, for example, for you to come in and drill a drinking water well. So there have to be controls put into place to make sure that only the appropriate uses are happening until that final cleanup is done. Next slide. This is sort of how our measures have been achieved over time across the country. Next slide. I just wanted to give you a quick, we recently, our program was initially run off of what we called the 2020 goals, which had some, the goals were to reach 95% of the facilities reach 3 of those measures over time. And we are now no longer in before 2020 timeframe. So we cleaned up, we finished up our 2020 goals and then developed new 2030 goals, and this is what they are. So we're currently working on working towards these 2030 goals. Next slide. And there are 5 of them. You can go back and read them if you like, but they're basically geared at making sure that cleanups are reaching those measures and reaching final cleanup, and then any long-term stewardship that's required for a cleanup where any contamination remains in place over time. So next slide. The 2030 goals are sort of over the next 10 years. We're working on them. I guess it's only 8 years now. So it's weird, we sort of did the numbers backwards, but goal 5, we're currently in 2022 and finishing up adjusting our pipeline of cleanups, and we're working on long-term stewardship program. And then goals 1, 2, and 3 are sort of making sure that cleanup pipeline is moving along and cleanups are happening. So I think that's it. Chandler, I can't believe it. I took up the whole time.
That is fantastic. You did such a great job and so appreciate it.
I wish I could tell people more about CERCLA, but sorry.
Well, I do see we have a number of questions here for you, and all of them pertain to RCRA. So we have a little bit of time, so I will go ahead and start with a couple of questions. You can follow along with the questions in the Q&A box if you'd like, and I'll start with this first one here. It's got 3 parts to it, and I think this first one might be a pretty interesting one. It asks, are state agencies able to intervene in citizen suits under RCRA, and if so, how?
Oh, that's a really good question. Let me think. I don't know exactly that they can intervene. I know that a state agency can file a citizen suit because that has happened. I'm not sure exactly how a state would be able to do that. I think no, but that's my best shot at that one. But that's a really interesting question. And I think citizen suits are something to really watch in RCRA, because there are some pretty powerful citizen suit provisions in RCRA, and I think people are starting to notice that. So I think that's a really good area to brush up on.
Well, thank you so much for your response on that. I appreciate it. Another question here from the same asker was, does the 11th Amendment mostly prevent state agencies from being a defendant in a citizen suit under RCRA?
Say that again. I'm sorry, Chandler.
Does the 11th Amendment prevent state agencies from being a defendant in a citizen suit under RCRA?
You know, I'm not an expert in citizen suits, and I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay, perfect. Here's a question I think would be maybe an interesting one to lay out what is a solid waste and what isn't. This person asks, is gasoline a hazardous waste that's regulated under RCRA?
Well, it could be. And you'd have to go through exactly the same analysis if it's a waste and then if it's hazardous. So if someone was discarding gasoline, which you could do a number of ways, you could actually literally decide you're going to send it, say, for disposal. Seems like an odd thing to do, but if you were literally sending it for disposal, then it would be a solid waste and it would likely be ignitable, so probably a hazardous waste. I guess, I mean, the more common scenario is where gasoline leaks. And in that case, it certainly is a waste in that it has been discarded once it leaks into the environment. So in that scenario, it would also be a hazardous waste. Hope that helps.
Perfect.
But really, anytime you need to think it through, it's really, you just have to stick with the first, is it a solid waste? And then second, is it a hazardous waste?
Perfect. We have a couple questions here about generators. And this first one asks, regarding generator status, if a contractor is excavating a site on behalf of a company and encounters contaminated soils, would the contractor, company, or both be deemed a generator of the waste?
Both. Let's see if I can explain that a little bit. So basically, the generator definition is by site. So anything that's happening at that site, or if it's really, site sounds like a cleanup site, but this is more like an operational site. Anything that's happening at that site gets counted towards generator status. And if the generator themselves is doing it, it counts. If they have contracted with somebody else to do something that generates a waste, it counts. So regardless as to whether it's a cleanup contractor doing a cleanup or somebody cleaning tanks, let's say cleaning out tanks and using solvents and generating spent solvents, they are actually doing that on behalf of the generator. And so the generator is liable, and the actual person generating the waste is, I can't remember exactly the language that we use, but both parties are responsible, but the counting for generator purposes happens by site. So it would include all of that activity. Good question.
Perfect. We have another generators question. And this one asks, by when do generators have to fully transition to the e-manifest system?
I think you can still use the paper system, but they will call you up and harass you. So they really are working on making it easy for people and supporting people and helping folks switch over to the e-manifest system. I think, however, if you're still using paper, I think there are some ways to keep doing that if you have to. I'm not sure if there's 100% changeover, but they really are working really hard to get everybody switched over to the electronic system. So literally calling folks up, encouraging them, helping them get registered, helping them get into the system and using the system, because it's really hugely beneficial all around to get everyone into the electronic system.
We have a really interesting question here that pertains to environmental justice. And it asks, could you touch a little bit on how environmental justice concerns thread through the entirety of RCRA, and how hazardous waste landfills or recycling facilities are often located in communities of color, and any EJ sections of the statutes or efforts being made to strengthen EJ through RCRA?
You know, that's a really great question. And I wish I hadn't taken up so much time so that I could have talked about both EJ and climate a little more. Yeah, the hazardous waste management system is a system that, you know, was built up over time, and the locations, particularly of Tsdfs, were, you know, they were built many years ago. Many of them before RCRA even came into being. And so control over location is really not something that RCRA has in terms of that, you know, dealing with environmental justice questions. But we are working really hard in the corrective action program, I can tell you specifically, with figuring out, using all the tools available to us, EJ Screen, that kind of thing, to identify which of our corrective action facilities are potentially in communities that may have EJ concerns, and working really hard to figure out how best to engage with communities to better understand their concerns and to better work through decision-making to make sure that people who are in the communities who are interested are involved in decision-making and have the support that they might need to participate effectively in decision-making. So it's a really important question. And the historical location of industrial activities is something that, the RCRA program doesn't have control over, but I feel like what we do have control over is sort of how we work with communities and how we engage effectively going forward. Great question.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your answer there. We have two questions about PFAS, and I'm going to try to combine them because they're both pretty interesting. I'm going to reword these, so I apologize to the original questioners, but I'm going to try to make it so they both fit together. The first question asks, generally, are PFAS something that EPA is looking at regulating or currently regulating under RCRA, as well as what is the process of introducing new substances into the RCRA regimes, such as for PFAS?
Great question, yay. Okay. So PFAS is a really, really challenging issue, as I'm sure anybody interested in, even whether you're in the environmental field or just interested are starting to know. So I guess I would just start off by saying I want everyone to be careful about using the term PFAS because it refers to an indeterminate number of chemicals depending on who you talk to. Some people will tell you, 5,000 chemicals. Some people will tell you 8,000 chemicals. It's a huge question around first of all, what that term PFAS means. And it's a very difficult issue. And in RCRA, you can see it, as is true in any environmental program. The way the program is set up, it's based on toxicity, for example. And so you have to look very carefully at what the toxicity of any particular chemical is. You can't just say, oh, this big class of chemicals, some of them are toxic, therefore we're going to regulate all of them. So you can't do that. That just is not the way the program is set up, and it wouldn't make sense anyway. So I just think it's really important that people are very aware that the knowledge of the chemistry of PFAS chemicals, of the science of PFAS chemicals, and the toxicity of PFAS chemicals is evolving quickly, not quickly enough, and we would all agree, but evolving now. And so we're now operating in an environment of evolving science, which is very difficult. And the way currently, I mean, the agency is working on PFAS. Every program across the agency is working on figuring out how best to use whatever the authorities of those programs are to try to figure out how to deal with PFAS. For RCRA specifically, we are working on two regulations. One is in my shop, which is we're looking at basically clarifying the corrective action regulations to make it clear that the corrective action authorities in the statute actually allow you to address hazardous wastes as defined in the statute. I'm going to make sure I'm getting this right. Which allows you a little flexibility in a particular case-by-case situation to address constituents of concern that may not yet be identified as a hazardous waste in the regulations, which is the way the authorities in the statute are written, but we're clarifying the regulations to make sure that that's true, so that if need be at a particular facility, you can address a constituent of concern that's posing a risk. So that's a rule we're working on in my shop that could address PFAS potentially. We are also in the waste identification part of my office, working on a rule looking at whether there are some PFAS chemicals for which the science is further along developed, that we can tell that they reach the toxicity standard and thus should be added to what's known as Appendix 8 of Part 261, which is a list of toxic constituents that is then used in other parts of the regulations that would be used as justification, either for corrective action cleanup or for a waste identification rule subsequently. So those are two ways that we in the RCRA program are looking at PFAS issues. I guess the Superfund program, which I'm not supposed to talk about because I'm not an expert, but is also working on a proposal to add some PFAS, a few like specific chemicals, not PFAS, but a few specific PFAS chemicals to the hazardous substance list under Superfund. I hope that helped.
That was a perfect answer. I really appreciate it. That was really fascinating. I see a couple more questions here. I think this one's a really interesting one too. It goes back to what is and what isn't a hazardous waste. And this one asks, are certain kinds of plastic waste, including pre-production plastic pellets or non-recyclable packaging, regulated as hazardous by RCRA?
Interesting question. I mean, really, you just have to go back to the same old structure that you do for anything else. So you would have to think through, is it a solid waste? Is it being discarded? And then is it hazardous? I'm trying to think through plastic pellets, for example, if they were being discarded. So if you were sending them to a disposal facility or dumping them on the ground or into the ocean, then they would be discarded. And then you'd have to think through whether they're hazardous or not. And I guess that would, I doubt they're ignitable, reactive, or corrosive. So you'd have to think through the toxicity. So it'd basically be dependent on whether they would fail the toxicity characteristic test for being toxic, which would depend on what constituents are in the plastic materials. So basically, anytime you're trying to think through whether something's a hazardous waste, you just have to start at the beginning, make sure it's being discarded and it is a solid waste before you start thinking through whether it's hazardous or not. I'm trying to think plastic pellets, that's something I can envision, you know, in an industrial process might be being discarded. What was the other one, Chandler? Packaging of some sort?
Yes, non-recyclable packaging.
So non-recyclable packaging, I guess, you know, if there's some kind of packaging that gets generated at an industrial facility, you know, I didn't mention, and maybe this would help. I didn't mention there is a household waste exclusion in RCRA. So homeowners, householders, apartment dwellers, any kind of home generated waste is not subject to RCRA. So like if you had a package, non-recyclable packaging that you threw away, that would never be a RCRA hazardous waste. But if there was some packaging that an industrial facility received their input materials in, that they gathered together, you know, you see those big bales of recycled materials or to be recycled materials. If they were not recyclable and hence being sent for disposal, discard, then you'd similarly have to think through, would it be a hazardous waste, which would be thinking through the toxicity characteristic.
Perfect. I think we have a time for a couple more questions. This next one asks, does the EPA verify that state authorized programs are meeting standards and goals?
Good question. Generally, yes. There's no sort of like regular procedure that we go through. When states are authorized, they are authorized based on their legislative authorities, their regulations in place, and their enforcement programs. Then after that, our regions work really closely with each of their states. And they have various ways that they work through sort of commitments for each year as to what the state is doing that year, how many inspections, what are they doing, that kind of thing. So the regions work very closely with the states in making sure that their programs are operating properly.
Perfect. And I will ask,
it's a pretty collaborative approach.
I will ask one more question, and it might bleed a little bit into the RCRA territory, or the CERCLA territory, excuse me, but I think it doesn't necessarily. But it's a really interesting question, and it asks, is there any attention being given to how climate change impacts the containment, storage, etc., of the hazardous wastes?
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting to think through. So I'll see if I can come up with an example. So the requirements for a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, for example, the way the regs are written to have very specific requirements, but they're designed to address whatever potential problems might happen. So I'm making this up as I go along here, but say, for example, you have a tank farm that hazardous waste tanks, and you have a containment system that's a big, basically a big concrete swimming pool, and the tanks are all in that pool. The way the regs are written, that containment system has to be adequate to protect the incidents that might happen, and adequate to protect that facility from whatever types of problems might happen. So in thinking it through, any system or any engineered system or waste management system that's been designed has been designed with certain assumptions in place about, let's say in my example, rainwater, for example. So rainwater is going to fall in that concrete pool and take up some of the capacity that might be needed for releases. And so the system has to be designed to ensure that there's adequate capacity to deal with both of those issues, any rainwater that might fall and any releases. So if the predictions are evolving over time, that there's likely to be more storm events, more rainwater, then that is going to need to be taken into account as that system is managed and is managed over time. So RCRA permits have a 10-year permit renewal timeframe. And basically, as those permits come up for renewal, any new issues, new information that's available, anything, could be anything. But specifically in this case, I guess, if the predictions are that at that particular location, you're going to get more rain, you would need to take into account in your release management system, whatever the future predictions might be. So I think in that way, climate change will sort of organically be addressed as we get smarter about the predictions and get smarter about how to think these things through over time. But in general, the RCRA program is designed to protect human health and the environment. And I think it's flexible enough to address changing conditions over time. And it's kind of up to us, I guess, to get smart about predictions and making sure that we're taking those predictions seriously and taking them into account going forward.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your responses to these many questions. I really appreciate it. Just really appreciate your ability to hop on and take over solo. You did a fantastic job and really, really appreciate it. Just want to say thank you so much to our audience for joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead. And an enormous thank you again to Charlotte. We so appreciate your contributions to today's program.
Well, I'm sorry that everybody learned more than they ever wanted to know about RCRA and not much about CERCLA, but but please do feel free. You've got my email address there on the last slide. I really encourage, if you're considering the environmental field, I would really encourage you to consider it seriously. And if there's anything I could do to help, please shoot me an email. I gave up on giving people my phone number because that doesn't seem to have any impact. Goes into the void somewhere. So, but definitely feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to catch up and touch base with you as you go forward.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. You did a fantastic job and just so appreciate it. Thank you all, and please take care and stay safe.
Thanks, Chandler. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.